The heat came up off the ground in a way you could see, a shimmer above the flint chips, and Klaus Schmidt walked up the low-rounded shoulder of the hill with his shirt already stuck to his back and the dust rising in a pale cloud around his boots at every step. And there was nothing there, not really, nothing that any sensible person would have crossed a country to see, only a bare swelling of land above the plain of Anlurfa in the far southeast of Turkey, a mound of the kind that sits on the horizon in that dry country like a sleeping animal, treeless, thorn bush snagging at the trouser leg, a scatter of broken limestone here and there, a single mulberry tree throwing a little shade near the top, and the long, slow ache of the sun over all of it. And he had come, that summer of 1994, half expecting to find nothing, because the paper record said there was nothing. Because 30 years earlier a survey team from America and from Turkey had walked this very rise and looked at these very broken slabs of stone breaking the soil and written the place down as unremarkable, a spot with some old graves in it. A medieval cemetery, perhaps, nothing to detain a serious person, and had folded their notes and moved along, and so he walked, and the flint chips rolled under his boots, and here is the thing. Here is the small thing that turned the whole afternoon. That turned, if I am honest with you, the whole story of how we understand ourselves. The flint would not stop. The ground was not merely scattered with worked stone. The ground was made of it. A density of chipped and shaped flint under his feet that no medieval graveyard could ever explain. A density that meant people, many people, over a very long time, sitting on this hill and working stone with their hands. And as he raised his eyes from that impossible carpet of flint to the crest of the mound, he saw the tops of things, the rounded shoulders of great stones just breaking the surface of the earth like the backs of something surfacing very slowly from deep water. And he stood there in the heat with the dust settling on him, and he understood, or he began to understand, in the way that the largest understandings arrive, quietly and almost sideways, that this was not a small place and not a late place, that this was something older and vaster than he had let himself imagine on the drive out, older than the paper record, older than the assumption, older than nearly everything, and that the hill under his boots had been waiting, patiently, without complaint, through all the centuries of being overlooked, for someone to stop and truly look. And he stayed, and he gave the rest of his life to that hill until his own death 20 years on. But that is a later part of the story, and we are in no hurry tonight, you and I. Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight I want to tell you the story of a hill, a real hill, a low bare hill of flint and thornbush in the south of Turkey, and of the extraordinary thing that was found sleeping inside it, and of the even more extraordinary questions that the finding has left us with. Questions which I think are the very best kind to carry with you into sleep. Because they are gentle questions, there is no violence in this story, no chase, no catastrophe, nothing that will jolt you upright in the dark. There is only patience and puzzlement, and the slow, unhurried triumph of a single curious mind who refused to walk past the extraordinary because it happened to be wearing the disguise of the ordinary. That is all this is. A hill that no one looked at properly for 30 years, and then a man who did, and what he found underneath. And I want to say to you, before we go any further, before I have told you a single thing about what the hill contained, that there is nothing here you need to solve, nothing to hold on to, no thread you must follow or lose the plot, no test in the morning. You may let your attention wander wherever it likes. You may follow every word, or you may let whole stretches of this drift past you, like the dust drifting off those boots, and it will not matter in the slightest. Because the story is a circle, and it keeps coming back round, and the hill itself is the most patient thing in it. So let me ask you, as I always do, to settle. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have crept up towards your ears over the course of this long day. Let them come down, and down a little further than that. Let the weight of you be taken fully by whatever is beneath you, the bed, the chair, the pillow, and let it be taken, You do not have to hold yourself up any longer tonight. That job is done. You may hand it over. Unclench if you can find it, the small hinge of the jaw. Let the breath go long and slow, and let it find its own soft rhythm without your minding it. And if, somewhere in the middle of all this, you find yourself slipping under, drifting off before I have got you anywhere near the end, good, that is the whole idea. Let yourself go. The hill will not be offended. The hill waited 11,000 years under the earth for someone to come and find it. It knows, better than anything else I could name for you, how to wait. It will keep its secrets warm for you until the next time. Now let me set the thing plainly before you, the way you might set an object down on the table between us under the lamp, before we turn it over and over and wonder at it. Because I think it is best always to see a thing clearly first in the plainest words, and only afterwards to sit with how strange it is. What Klaus Schmidt found sleeping inside that hill, and what 40 years of careful, painstaking excavation have gone on uncovering since, is this: rings of standing stones. Great rings, circles or nearly circles, oval sometimes, of tall stone pillars set upright in the ground, and between the pillars low walls and benches of stone joining them together, so that each ring makes a kind of enclosed round chamber open to the sky, and these rings are nested into the hill, one and then another, more of them than have yet been dug out, most of them still lying under the earth as we speak. And the pillars themselves, I want you to see them. The pillars are not rough boulders and not simple posts. They are shaped, they are limestone, quarried and dressed and carved by hand, and they are cut into a very particular form, a form you will come to know well tonight, because it is the signature of the whole place. They are shaped like the letter T. A tall, narrow, upright shaft of stone, and set across the top of it, at right angles, a broad, flat slab like the crossbar of a T, or like a great flat head resting on tall shoulders. Some of these T-shaped pillars are modest, the height of a person, but the greatest of them, the two that stand free in the very centre of each ring, facing one another across the round floor, rise to 5 meters, to 6, taller than the height of a room, taller than 3 tall people standing on one another, and they weigh. And I will give you this number gently, and only the once for now, and we will come back to it later and truly sit with it. They weigh many tons apiece, some of them 10 tons, some 15, and there is one, quarried but never raised, that would have weighed close to 50. And across the faces of these great pale pillars, cut in shallow relief so that the figures seem to swim just beneath the surface of the stone, are animals. Foxes, wild boars with their tusks, snakes, many snakes, gliding, scorpions, spiders, long-legged cranes and other birds, vultures with their wings spread, the great wild cattle called aurochs, gazelles, the wild asses of the plain, a whole silent menagerie of the wild things of that world, carved with real skill and real attention into stone by people who had for tools nothing harder than other stone. That is the object. Rings of carved T-shaped limestone pillars, some as tall as a house is high and as heavy as a loaded lorry, standing in circles on a hilltop, watched over by carved foxes and boars and vultures and snakes. Hold that picture. And now that you can see it, let me give you the single fact that anchors this entire night. The fact that turns this from a curious ruin into one of the most astonishing things that human beings have ever been found to have made. The fact that I would like you to carry with you as you drift, turning it over softly the way you might turn a smooth stone in your hand in the dark. This place was built about 11,500 years ago. Not 11,500 years ago as a rough estimate that might come down with more digging, 11,500 years ago as a floor, a beginning, with the earliest rings older still. Sit with that number for a moment, because a number that large does very little on its own. It is just a smear of zeros, and the mind slides off it. So let me make it tangible for you the way I mean to make everything tangible tonight, one thing at a time, gently. When these great pillars were raised and set standing in their rings, There was no farming anywhere on earth. None, no fields, no sown grain, no herded flocks, no barns. The people who made this were hunters and gatherers, who fed themselves by following the wild herds and reaping the wild grasses and knowing every root and berry of that country by heart. There was no pottery, not a bowl, not a jar, not a fired clay cup anywhere in the world. That would come later. There was no writing, and would be none for 5,000 years and more. No one alive could set down a single word to say what any of this meant, which is a great part of why we are still guessing. There was no metal of any kind in human hands, no bronze, no iron, no copper tool. Every cut you see in that limestone was made with stone striking stone. And there was no wheel. Sit with that one especially, in the dark. No wheel. Not for carts, not for pots, not for anything. The wheel had not been thought of, would not be thought of for thousands of years yet. And so these 10 and 15-ton pillars were quarried and moved and lifted upright with no wheel to help, and no ox or ass or horse to pull, for those two were still wild and unbroken. No farming, no pottery, no writing, no metal, no wheel, no beast of burden, no village even. And yet, these people came to this bare hill and raised the oldest monumental sanctuary that we know of anywhere on the face of the earth. The oldest. So far as we can tell, so far as anyone has yet found, there is nothing older of its kind. And let me give you the two comparisons that make the age of it land in the body rather than the head. Because we all carry a rough sense of what old means, and it is almost always far too young. You know Stonehenge, on its green English plain, the great grey trilithons, the mystery of them, the sense we all have that they are impossibly ancient. This hill in Turkey is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. 6,000! The whole gulf of time between us, now, and the Roman legions is not as wide as the gulf between Stonehenge and this, and the pyramids of Egypt, those other monuments we reach for whenever we want to say a thing is old beyond imagining. This hill is older than the Great Pyramids by 7,000 years. When the first stone of the first pyramid was cut, Göbekli Tepe had already been standing, and had already been abandoned, and had already been buried under its own hill, for longer than all of recorded history put together stretches back from you tonight. I find that almost unbearably moving, if I am honest with you, and I have carried it a long time and it has not worn smooth. That we were taught, most of us, in school, in the tidy diagrams, that the story went in a neat straight line, first the wandering hunters, poor and few and scattered, scraping by, then, slowly, the invention of farming which let people settle, then villages, then towns, then the leisure and the surplus and the organisation out of which, at long last, temples and monuments and art and the sacred could finally be afforded. First bread, then God, so the tidy story went. And this hill, this bare rounded hill of flint and thorn bush that a survey team wrote off as a graveyard and walked away from, this hill quietly says, no, not necessarily, not here. Here the temple came first. Here, before the loaf of bread was ever baked, before a wheel had ever turned, before a single word had ever been written down, hunter-gatherers with flint in their hands raised a ring of carved stone giants to 5 and 6 meters and set them watching one another across a round floor open to the stars. We will spend the whole of tonight, slowly and in no hurry at all, sitting with what that might mean. But not yet. Not yet. For now I only want us to sit in the strangeness of it, the plain fact of it, before a single word of explanation, because I think the strangeness is the most restful part, and I would not want to rush past it to get to answers that we do not truly have. So here is what I would give you to hold, this first time as you begin to settle. Picture the hill again, as it is now in the low gold light of the late afternoon. Picture the pale rings of stone breaking the brown earth, the great T-shaped pillars standing patient in their circles, the carved foxes and the carved vultures keeping their silent watch across the surfaces as they have kept it for 11,500 years, through every sunrise and every star of all that unthinkable stretch of time. Saying nothing, needing nothing, waiting. Picture that most of the hill is still earth, still sleeping, the enclosures still to be found lying quiet in the dark under the ground, unhurried, undisturbed, in no rush whatsoever to be woken. And think of the stone itself as a kind of letter. A message set down not in words, for there were no words, but in shaped and standing stone, and addressed, though its makers could not have known it, across 11,500 years, to you, lying here now in the warm dark at the far end of all that time. A letter from the very first people who ever felt the need to build something great and lasting and sacred, from the first wanderers, of whom, in the plainest sense, you and I are the distant inheritors. We have not yet read a line of the letter. We do not know truly what it says, but the hill is not going anywhere, and neither for the moment are we. So let the shoulders stay soft. Let the number sit lightly, 11,500 years, older than the pyramids by 7, and every cut in the stone made by hand, without metal, without the wheel. There is nothing to do with it tonight but wonder, and we have all the time in the world, and so we come to the strange, slow story of how a thing so vast could lie so long unseen, and I want to tell it to you the way it happened, which is to say gently, and out of order, with the world walking past the miracle for the better part of a lifetime before anyone stopped and truly looked. Because here is the first thing to sit with. In the dark. Before we go any further, this hill was not lost. That is what undoes me a little, if I am honest with you. It was not swallowed by jungle, not sunk beneath the sea, not hidden in some trackless waste where no foot had trodden for 1,000 years. It was there, on an ordinary rise of ground a short way from a working city, under a sky that farmers had ploughed beneath for generation upon generation, a hill that people had walked over and grazed their flocks upon and gathered their flints from, without ever once suspecting that beneath the thin skin of soil and thornbush lay the oldest temple in the world, folded into the earth like a letter into an envelope, waiting. It was not lost. It was merely unrecognised. And there is a whole quiet lesson in that difference. One I find myself turning over again and again on nights like this. Because how many extraordinary things, do you suppose, are sitting in plain view at this very moment, wearing the plain grey coat of the ordinary, waiting for the one pair of eyes that will finally see them for what they are. But I am getting ahead of myself, and there is no need to hurry. The hill certainly did not. So neither shall we. Let me take you back then, past the day I have already told you about, the day in 1994 when the German archaeologist walked up that mound and felt the ground beneath his boots begin, quietly to change everything he thought he knew. Let me take you back further still, to a hotter, dustier decade, to the early 1960s, when a joint team of American and Turkish researchers came across this same hill in the course of a wide survey of the region, one of those patient, sweeping efforts to map what lay upon the land, to note the old mounds and the scatter of ancient stone across the whole broad country of the upper Euphrates. They were not careless people, you understand. They were doing exactly what they had come to do, walking the ground, marking the sites, recording what the surface offered up to them, and the surface here offered up a low, rounded hill, and, upon it, some broken slabs of limestone breaking through the earth. The tops of great stones showing at the crown of the mound like the shoulders of something half risen from sleep. They saw the stones. That is the part I want you to hold. They were not blind. They saw the very tops of the pillars we now marvel at. The uppermost inches of stones that would one day be understood as the oldest monuments raised by human hands. And they looked at those broken slabs, and they thought, reasonably, sensibly, in perfect keeping with everything anyone knew or could have known at that time, that they were looking at the remains of a graveyard, most likely something medieval, perhaps a Byzantine burial ground, a place where the dead of some later, ordinary century had been laid beneath simple markers of stone. And having thought that, having written it down in the careful, unremarkable language of a survey report, they moved on, They moved on, and the hill closed over its secret once more, and it slept for another 30 years. I want you to sit with the human gentleness of that mistake, because it is not really a mistake at all. Not in the way we usually mean the word, not a failure of attention or of care. It is something softer and stranger than that. It is the plain fact that we can only see what we have room to see, that the mind, presented with the utterly unexpected, will reach first and reasonably for the nearest familiar shape and lay it over the thing before us like a template, and call it done. A rounded hill, some broken standing stones, a scatter of worked flint. What is that? Why, that is a graveyard. Of course it is. What else could it be? Because the alternative, the true alternative, was at that moment simply unthinkable. To have stood on that mound in the early 1960s and to have said aloud, "This is a temple, and it is older than farming, older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than the very first mud brick village built by wandering hunters with nothing but flint in their hands," would have been not a discovery, but a kind of madness. A thing so far outside the settled understanding of how human beings became human beings that no serious person could have said it and been believed. The knowledge that would let you see the hill correctly did not yet exist, and so the ones who walked across it could not have seen it, however keen their eyes, because seeing is never only a matter of the eyes, it is a matter of what the mind has been given permission to imagine. They saw broken stones, and they saw a graveyard, and they were, in a sense, not entirely wrong, though we will come to that later, gently when we speak of the dead. But they walked away, and the great rings kept their silence beneath the soil, and no one came to trouble that silence for 3 more decades. Think of everything that happened in the wider world across those 30 years while the hill went on sleeping, all the noise and the change and the hurry of it, and all the while the pillars stood in their buried rings in the warm dark of the earth, exactly as they had stood for 11,000 years already, patient beyond any patience we could summon, keeping their watch. There is something almost tender in it to me. The hill was in no hurry to be found. It had waited so long already that 30 more years was nothing, was a single slow breath in the vast quiet lung of its sleeping. And then, at last, in 1994, came the one pair of eyes that had been given, by long study and by the slow widening of all that we had learned in the meantime, the permission to see. Klaus Schmidt was his name, and I have said it before, but I will say it again, because it is a name worth resting on. A careful, dedicated German archaeologist who had worked in this region and knew its stones and its silences, who had been part of the excavations at a nearby Neolithic site, and carried in his mind a whole living sense of how old this landscape truly was, and what kinds of impossible seeming things its people had been capable of. When he came to that same mound, when he saw those same broken slabs of limestone and that same dense litter of worked flint underfoot, he did not see a medieval graveyard. He saw something that made the breath catch. He saw in the sheer quantity of shaped flint scattered across the hill, and in the shape and setting of those stones, a signature of enormous antiquity and of enormous effort. And he understood, in a slow-rising certainty that must have been almost too much to hold, that this was not late and ordinary, but early and extraordinary beyond anything, that the graveyard was no graveyard, that the hill was full of standing stones raised in an age so remote that it changed the shape of the whole story. He is said to have understood, more or less at once, that if he was right he would not leave this place, that a discovery like this was the sort of thing to which a person gives the rest of their days, and that is very nearly what happened. For he came back, and he stayed, and he gave himself to that hill for 20 years, working its soil and reading its stones with the deep, unhurried patience that such a place demands, until his death in the year 2014. 20 years, a fifth of a lifetime, or nearly, poured out upon a single hill, and even then only the smallest fraction of it uncovered. I find that a beautiful thing to hold as you lie there in the dark, the image of a man returning season after season, year after year, to the same rounded rise of ground, brushing the soil of 11,000 years from the shoulders of the stone beings, one careful handful at a time, in no hurry, refusing to be in a hurry. Because you cannot hurry a thing like this, and he knew it. He did not tear the hill open. He did not race to empty it of its wonders and its answers. He worked it slowly, deliberately, mapping and recording and lifting away only what could be lifted away with proper care. And, crucially, and I want you to hold on to this too, he chose, and those who have come after him have chosen, to leave most of the hill alone. Most of Göbekli Tepe has never been excavated at all. It remains where it has always been, folded into the earth, unseen, its rings of pillars still standing in the dark beneath the surface exactly as their makers left them, and they have been left there on purpose, not out of neglect but out of a kind of wisdom, out of the understanding that the tools and the methods of some future century may read those buried stones far more gently and far more fully than our own can, and that it would be a poor sort of greed to dig it all up now and spend it all now, when it has waited so long and can wait a little longer. And so, in a way that I find quietly perfect, the sleeping hill goes on sleeping still. We have only wakened a corner of it. The greater part remains in its long rest beneath the soil, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. And perhaps there is comfort for us in that too, the knowledge that not everything need be uncovered and solved and finished in our own restless lifetime, that some things may be left in peace for those who come after, that the questions can be handed onward like a lamp passed carefully from one set of hands to the next. Now let me tell you gently what that wakened corner has shown us, because it is remarkable, and because setting it before you plainly is the surest way to begin to understand the strangeness of the place. When the soil was lifted away, season by patient season, what emerged from the hill was not a single monument but a whole gathering of them, several great enclosures nested within the mound, some of them roughly circular, and some of them more oval, rings of standing stone set into the earth like a family of quiet rooms without roofs. And each of these enclosures follows the same essential plan, so that once you have understood one, you have understood the shape of them all, a ring of the tall T-shaped limestone pillars set at intervals around the edge, spaced apart and joined between by low walls and by benches of stone running along the inner side, as though the whole thing were made to be gathered within, to be stood in and moved around, and perhaps sat upon, and then, standing free and alone at the very centre of each ring, not one but two pillars, taller than all the rest, facing one another across the open middle of the enclosure like a pair of presiding figures, like the two most important beings in the room, holding the whole circle in their gaze. That is the shape of it. A ring of tall stones about the edge, joined by wall and bench, and two greater stones standing alone at the heart, and this pattern repeats from enclosure to enclosure across the hill. The same idea raised again and again by the same people over many generations, each ring its own gathering, its own quiet congregation of stone. And here I must set before you the thing that is missing, because in this case the absence is very nearly as eloquent as the presence, and it points us toward the deepest strangeness of all. When you dig into an ancient site where people truly lived, where they made their homes and passed their ordinary days, you find the debris of ordinary living everywhere, unmistakable and abundant. The footings of houses laid out in rows, the blackened hearths where families cooked their food evening after evening, the pits where grain and goods were stored against the lean months, the middens heaped with the broken and discarded stuff of daily life, the whole rich untidy residue of people simply being at home. That is what a settlement looks like when you lift the soil from it. And that is precisely what Göbekli Tepe, on the hill itself, does not look like. There is very little sign, up on that rise among the great rings, of ordinary domestic dwelling at all. Few proper houses, few hearths of the kind that speak of daily cooking and daily warmth, little of the storage and the clutter, and the accumulated mess of a place where people made their homes and stayed. The stones are grand and deliberate and enormous, raised at tremendous cost, and yet around them there is a strange quiet, where the noise of a living town ought to be. And what that absence whispers, gently, is something that took a long time to be believed, and is still being weighed even now, that this was not a place where people lived, but a place where people came. That they gathered here, from wherever they roamed across that wide and open country, and raised these rings together, and did here whatever it was they came to do among the standing beings and the carved animals, and then went away again to the places where they actually lived. A gathering place, then, and not a home, a place made not for the ordinary business of survival, but for something else entirely. Something that mattered enough to move mountains of stone for, and yet had nothing to do with the daily getting of bread. Sit with that for a moment in the dark. Before there were towns for people to leave, people were already leaving wherever they were to come together in one appointed place and build. And they called it, or rather we call it, by a name so humble and so homely that it makes me smile every time. A name given in the plain local tongue for the plain shape of the mound itself. Göbekli Tepe, which means near enough, Potbelly Hill. The hill with the belly. The round-bellied hill. Is that not a tender thing that the oldest sanctuary on earth, this place of towering stone beings and silent carved watchers and mysteries we have barely begun to sound, should carry across all that unfathomable depth of time such a soft, affectionate, almost comic little name, the name a family might give to a familiar hump of ground they passed every day? The Potbelly Hill, the one that swells a little at the middle, there, you know the one, the people who named it that had no idea what slept beneath their feet. To them it was just the round hill, the belly-shaped rise, a landmark, an ordinary thing. And yet the name is somehow exactly right, for the hill was indeed full, was swollen and rounded because it held something within it. It was quite literally pregnant with its buried rings, carrying its rooms of standing stone deep in its belly through all the long centuries, while the people who named it grazed their flocks upon its back and never knew. Potbelly Hill. I would have you keep that name close as we go on, and think of it kindly, this humble word for a place of such vast and quiet grandeur, because it holds within it the whole gentle theme of the night. The extraordinary wearing the coat of the ordinary, the miraculous hidden inside the homely, the letter across 11,000 years sealed inside a rounded hill that everyone walked past, and no one, for the longest time, thought to open. And now the hill is opening, slowly, a corner at a time, in no hurry, keeping most of itself still folded away in the dark for a wiser age to read, and we, lying here in the quiet, are among the first in 11,000 years to be let a little way into its secret, to stand in imagination within those wakened rings and look up at the tall stones and begin, gently, to wonder what on earth they are. So let us walk in among them now, you and I, slowly, the way one moves through a place that asks for quiet, and let us look at these stones properly, for looking is the whole of it tonight, and there is nothing you need do but let your eye be led. From a little distance, when you first come up into one of the enclosures, and the pillars stand around you in their great uneven ring, they seem, if I am honest, almost plain, almost stern, like nothing so much as tall stone posts, roughly the height of 2 grown men. Some of them, pale grey gold limestone, worn and weathered, planted upright in the earth with the flat sides facing you, and it would be the easiest thing in the world to take them for what they most resemble at that first glance, which is markers, or supports, or the bare uprights of some roof long fallen in. That is how they read, at first, tall, silent, faceless, and it is only as you come closer, as the light rakes across them at the low angle of morning or of evening, and picks out the shallow shadows that lie in the stone, that you begin to see there is more here than a post, and that the shape itself, which you had taken for a happy accident of quarrying, was meant and shaped, and is trying, very quietly, to tell you something. For the pillars are not simple columns. They are cut in the form of a great letter T, a broad flat capstone laid crosswise upon a tall narrow shaft, and once you have seen the tea you cannot unsee it, and the question arrives of its own accord, unbidden, in the back of your mind, the question that took the excavators themselves some time to voice aloud, which is simply this. Why a T, and why so deliberately, and why the same shape again and again in enclosure after enclosure across the whole buried hill? And the answer, when it comes, is the quiet turning point of the whole night, the moment the stones stop being architecture and become something else, and I want to give it to you slowly, the way it was given, the way it dawns, rather than the way it is announced. Look at the two great central pillars, the tallest of them all, the pair that stand free in the very middle of each ring, taller than the ones set into the surrounding wall, standing apart and facing one another across the enclosed ground. Look at the long shaft of one of those central stones, and follow it down with your eye from the broad flat top, down the front face, and there, carved in low relief so shallow that you might miss it in a flat light, you begin to make out a shape you know, a shape your own body knows, for running down each side of the pillar, faint but unmistakable once seen, is an arm. An arm carved the length of the stone, bending gently at the elbow, coming round the front, and ending, low down on the shaft, above where a person's waist would be, in a hand with long, slender, carefully carved fingers. Two hands, one from each side, their fingertips reaching in toward one another across the front of the stone, almost meeting, held there over the belly of the pillar in a gesture so human, so recognizable, so unbearably familiar, that when you finally see it the whole ring changes around you and the breath goes a little short. For if there are arms, and if there are hands folded over the front, then the broad flat top of the T is not a capstone at all. It is a head. It is the head of a being seen from the side and abstracted almost to nothing, a head reduced to a plain, flat plane with no face, no eyes, no mouth, and the long shaft below it is a body. And the ring you are standing in is not a ring of posts, but a ring of stone beings, gathered standing facing one another and facing you, with their hands folded quietly over their bellies. I want you to sit with that for a moment, in the dark, before we go any further, because it is one of the strangest and gentlest things I know, and I find it almost unbearably moving, if I am honest with you. 11,500 years ago, on a barren hill, people took stone and made from it a company of tall faceless beings and set them in a circle with their hands folded, and there they have stood, patient, watchful, faceless, through all the ages between. And there they stand tonight while you and I are here in the warm dark, and there they will stand when we are both long gone. And the hands are the tender part. For it is one thing to raise a pillar, a slab, a monument, a thing. It is quite another to give it arms, and to bring the hands round to the front, and to fold them as one might fold one's own hands in patience, or in prayer, or in simple rest at the end of a long day. That fold of the hands is the moment the maker's whole feeling comes through the stone, the moment you understand that whoever carved this did not think they were shaping an object, but rather portraying a someone, and we do not know, and this is one of our restful unknowings, we do not know who that someone is meant to be. And there is more still, carved lower down on those central stone beings, for below the folded hands, around the middle of the shaft, runs a broad carved belt cinched about the stone body as a real belt is cinched about a real waist, sometimes worked with little symbols and buckle shapes we cannot read, and hanging from that belt, carved down over the front of the lower body, is a garment, a covering, rendered in the stone as a fringe or a bundle of narrow dangling shapes that the excavators came to read as pelts, as the skins of animals, most likely fox skins, a loincloth of fox pelts, hung from the belt of a being made of stone. And so the picture completes itself, quietly, detail by detail, the way a face emerges from shadow. Here is a tall being with a plain flat head and no face, with long arms running down its sides, with slender hands folded over its belly, wearing a belt and a loincloth of foxskins, standing in a ring with others of its kind. Not a post, not a marker, a being. And whether these tall folded-handed beings are meant to be gods, the great powers that the builders felt moving through their world, or ancestors, the honoured dead of the people who raised them, or spirits, or the maker's own idea of themselves cast up huge and faceless and eternal in stone, we simply do not know, and I would not pretend to you that we do. The facelessness feels deliberate. A face would fix them, would name them, would make them this person rather than that one, but a plain flat head with no eyes and no mouth keeps them open, keeps them everyone and no one, keeps them, in a way, waiting. And I find that I do not mind not knowing. The not knowing, here, is soft. The questions are more restful than any answer would be. Now, having seen the beings for what they are, let your eye travel over their surfaces, over the broad flat sides of the shafts and the edges of the great heads, because the pillars do not stand there bare. They are carved, many of them, all across their bodies, in that same shallow low relief, with animals, and this is the second wonder of the close looking, and in some ways the stranger of the two, for it is a whole living menagerie set into the stone, a hillside of wild creatures gathered upon the standing beings, and once you begin to notice them you find them everywhere, moving across the pale stone as if the pillars were the walls of some silent night forest. Here, along the flank of one pillar, a fox runs, its body carved in profile, long and low and lithe, the brush of its tail streaming out behind it, its legs gathered as though caught in mid-leap, forever leaping along the stone and never landing. There, on another face, a wild boar stands foursquare and heavy, its shoulders high, its snout low, and along its jaw the maker has taken care to show the tusks, curved and bared, so that even now, even in worn stone, the animal reads as dangerous, as a thing you would not wish to meet on the path. On the shaft of another you find snakes, and not one snake but many, a whole cluster of them, gliding downward in parallel wavering lines, their small triangular heads all pointed the same way, a cascade of serpents pouring down the stone like water finding its way over a rock. And there are scorpions, carved flat and splayed with their claws spread and the segmented tail curled up over the back, patient and poised. There are spiders. There are the long-legged wading birds we call cranes, standing tall on the stone with their necks folded. There are other birds too, and on one famous pillar, a bird carved with its wings spread wide, opened out across the face of the stone, as though caught at the very instant of rising into flight, or of coming down to land, and we will come back to that particular bird in a moment gently, because it carries a weight the others do not. And beyond these there are aurochs, the great wild cattle, huge-horned and long vanished from the world now, their massive heads lowered, and gazelles, slender and quick, and the wild arses of the old Anatolian plains, and creatures we can no longer surely name at all. And here is the thing that the excavators noticed, and that I think you will notice too. Once it is pointed out, and that is one of the deep small mysteries of the hill, of all these carved animals gathered in such number across so many stones, almost none are the gentle ones, almost none are the tame or the harmless or the useful. There are no sheaves of grain here. There are no fields, no huts, no cook fires, no scenes of people at their daily work, no woman grinding, no child, no loaf, none of the small, warm, ordinary business of a life. There is scarcely a plant to be found on any of them. What there is, overwhelmingly, is the wild, and more than the wild, the dangerous wild, the fox with its cunning, the boar with its tusks, the snake, the scorpion, the spider, the vulture, the great horned bull. The creatures carved onto these beings are, for the most part, the creatures that bite and gore and sting and prey, the powers of the wild world at its most formidable, the things that a person out on that ancient plain, with no walls and no metal and no farm, would have had every reason to fear, and to respect, and perhaps to honour. And so the scholars who have given their lives to this hill wonder, carefully without ever quite settling it, what these carved animals were for, and what they meant to the people who cut them, and the guesses they offer are gentle ones, and I will lay a few of them before you, not as answers, but as things to turn over quietly as you drift. Perhaps the animals were totems, each one the sign and the guardian of a particular people, a particular band or clan or lineage who came to the hill and knew their own enclosure by its snakes or its boars or its foxes, as later peoples would know their houses by their emblems. Perhaps they were guardians in a plainer sense, spirits set to watch, dangerous creatures posted about the dangerous work of the sanctuary to keep it, to guard the folded-handed beings, and whatever the beings themselves were guarding. Perhaps they were the powers of the living world made visible and brought in close, the fearsome forces of the wild honoured and gathered and given a place to stand, so that the people who had not yet tamed a single field or fenced a single beast were carving, upon their first great monument, not the world they had mastered, but the world that still mastered them. Not the tame, but the wild. Not what they owned, but what they stood in awe of. I find that a moving thought to rest in, that the very first thing our kind chose to carve upon the very first great sanctuary was not ourselves triumphant, but the wild and dangerous world we were still small within, honoured rather than conquered, kept rather than killed. And now let us come, softly, and without any fright in it, to that one bird I set aside, the one whose wings are spread, because it belongs to the tenderest and most uncertain corner of all this looking. On one of the pillars, in one of the enclosures, there is a scene carved that is more crowded and more deliberate than most, and among its figures is a large bird with a bald head and broad open wings, and the scholars who study these things have come, many of them, to read that bird as a vulture. Now a vulture, to us, may sound a grim thing to find carved upon a sacred stone, but I would ask you to set aside the shiver the word brings, because to the people of that time and that world, and to many people since across the old lands of the Near East, the vulture was very likely not a creature of horror at all, but a creature of passage, a keeper of a threshold, the one that carried the dead up and out of the world of the living. For we know, from other sites of that same deep age scattered across the region, that these early peoples had careful and elaborate ways with their dead, and in particular with the skulls of their dead, which they sometimes kept, and cleaned and marked and honoured, and carried with them, so that the dead were not simply gone, but stayed in a way present, cared for, held on to. And so this bird with its spread wings on its carved and crowded stone is read by many as belonging to that world of the honoured dead, a scene of passage, of the carrying away and the keeping, of the tending of those who had died, rendered not in dread but in reverence, in ceremony, in care. Whether that reading is right in all its particulars, whether skulls were truly curated on this hill as they were elsewhere, whether the folded-handed beings themselves are the honoured dead raised up in stone, or the powers that received them, we do not, and perhaps never will, fully know, and I will not tie it into a neat knot for you, because it does not come tied. It comes to us as it is, worn and partial and open, a bird with spread wings upon a stone, a fold of hands over a stone belly, a run of snakes pouring down a shaft, a fox forever leaping and never landing, a whole silent company of faceless beings standing in their rings with their animals gathered about them, keeping, as they have kept for 11,500 years, their long and patient and utterly wordless watch. And that, tonight, is enough to hold, not to solve, only to hold. So hold it, if you like, as you lie there in the dark, the ring of tall stone beings with their hands folded quietly over their bellies, the fox leaping along the flank of one of them, the light going soft and low across the pale worn stone, and the animals keeping their silent watch, as they always have, while you rest. And so, having stood a while among the folded hands and the watching foxes, let us turn now and ask the plainest, most childlike question of all, the question a small child would ask if you led her up that hill and set her down before one of those great stones, which is simply, how? How did they do it? Because the more you sit with it, in the dark, the less believable it becomes, and I mean that as the highest sort of praise a thing can earn. Consider only the stone itself, the raw material, before any carving, before any raising. The pillars were cut from the living limestone of the hill and the shelves of rock nearby, quarried out of the bedrock itself. And you can still see, not far from the enclosures, the places where they worked, where a pillar was begun and for whatever reason never finished, one of them lying there yet in its bed of rock, still half attached to the ground that bore it, more than 6 meters long, waiting through all these thousands of years to be stood up, and never stood. I find that unfinished stone almost as moving as the raised ones, if I am honest with you. It is a task set down and not returned to. But think, for a moment, of what it took even to begin such a thing. They had no metal. Let me say that again slowly, because we say it so quickly that it slides past us without landing. They had no metal at all. Not a knife of it, not a chisel of it, not the smallest sliver of bronze or iron in the whole of their world, because the working of metal had not yet been invented, and would not be invented for thousands of years after these people had lived and died and been forgotten. What they had was stone, and flint, and the patience of hands. To carve limestone you use a harder stone, to quarry it you use pounding stones, and picks of flint, and fire and water perhaps to crack it along its seams, and above all you use time, a great and unhurried quantity of time, tapping and grinding and lifting away the chips a handful at a time, until a pillar the height of 2 tall men has been freed from the hill that held it. And the chips, the countless flakes of worked flint left behind by all that labour, are part of what covered the hill so thickly that Klaus Schmidt, walking up in the heat, knew at once he was standing on something made by human hands. The very debris of the making became the skin of the sleeping hill. Now imagine the pillar is cut, and it lies there in the quarry, this long spine of stone, and you must move it. How heavy is it? Here is where the numbers begin, and I will give them to you one at a time, gently, and make each one into something you can feel in your own arms, because a number by itself is a cold thing and I do not want to hand you cold things at this hour. The smaller pillars are heavy enough. 1 ton, 2 tons, the weight you could not shift alone if you strained at it all day. But the great central pillars, the tallest of the stone beings, weigh something on the order of 10 tons, and some are reckoned heavier still, 15. And there is at least one, that unfinished giant lying in its quarry bed, that would have weighed something close to 20 tons had they ever raised it. 20 tons. Let me make that real for you. That is the weight of a loaded lorry, the kind you pull aside for on the road, the kind whose passing you feel in the ground through your feet. That is the weight of perhaps 4 or 5 elephants standing together. And they moved it, or moved its 10 and 15 ton brothers, which is scarcely less impossible, across the ground, up the slope of the hill, and then, hardest of all, they stood it upright and set it in a socket cut in the bedrock and packed it firm so that it would stand for 11,000 years, and it has. Without the wheel. I want to dwell on that, because we have lived so long with the wheel that we cannot easily feel its absence. But they had none. There was no cart. There was no barrow. There was nothing to roll a load upon, except, perhaps, rollers laid on the ground and shifted from back to front as the stone crept forward, log by log. If they even had suitable timber, which on that dry hill is itself a question. And there was no beast of burden either, no ox, no horse, no arse in harness, because the animals were all still wild. The aurochs and the wild arses and the gazelles were creatures you hunted with a spear, not creatures you yoked to a sledge, for the taming of animals lay, like farming, like metal, like the wheel, still ahead of these people in a future they could not see. So it was muscle. It was human muscle, and human muscle alone, and rope of some kind, twisted from plant fibre or hide, and ramps of earth, and levers of wood or stone, and the one thing they had in the greatest abundance, which was each other. Many hands, many backs, many people pulling together on the ropes in some rhythm, some chant perhaps, some counting song lost to us forever, heaving a stone the weight of a lorry up a barren hill under the Anatolian sun. And how many people does that take? We cannot know the number exactly, but when engineers and archaeologists sit down and reckon it honestly, they arrive at hundreds. Hundreds of people to raise even one of the great enclosures. Not a family, not a band, not the 20 or 30 souls who might travel together following the herds. Hundreds gathered in one place, pulling together, over days and weeks and, across the whole life of the hill, over generations. And here is where the marvel deepens from a marvel of engineering into a marvel of something far stranger, and I want you to follow me slowly into it. Because this is the heart of the whole night. To gather hundreds of people in one place, you must feed them. This is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing of all. A person who is quarrying limestone with a flint pick and hauling 10-ton stones up a hillside is a person who is very hungry indeed, who needs a great deal of food day after day, and you have gathered hundreds of them, and they are not growing that food, because there are no fields, because farming does not yet exist. Sit with that. Where does the bread come from when there is no bread? Where does the feast come from? To feed the builders of a temple in a world that has not yet learned to plant a seed and wait for the harvest. They must have hunted it and gathered it, driven the wild gazelle in great numbers, netted the birds, cracked and ground the wild grasses that grew on the hillsides round about, the wild ancestors of wheat that stood there unbidden, brought it all up the hill and cooked it in great quantities to feed the crowd that was raising the stones. And when you have understood that, you are standing at the very edge of the reframe, the great turning over of the old story that Göbekli Tepe forces upon us. And I want to lay the old story out first, plainly and kindly, before I turn it upside down, because it is a good story, a tidy story, the story you and I were both taught, and it deserves to be set down gently, rather than simply knocked over. The old story goes like this. Once, it says, human beings were wanderers, following the animals and the seasons, gathering what grew wild, never staying long in one place, never building much, because you cannot carry a temple on your back, and you cannot tend a monument you will leave behind in a month. And then, the story says, came the great discovery, the discovery of farming, that a seed put in the ground will grow, that you can sow and reap, that you can store the grain against the winter. And farming, the old story says, changed everything, because a people who farm must stay near their fields, and so they settled, and built the first villages, and the villages being settled could accumulate, could store food, could grow in number, could free some hands from the endless daily search for something to eat. And only then, the story says, only once there were villages, and stored surplus and some measure of leisure and wealth and organisation, only then could a people afford to raise up something as grand and useless, in the practical sense, as a temple, a great building for the gods, made by a society rich enough and settled enough and organised enough to spare the labour. First the farm, then the village, then, much later at the very top of the ladder, the temple. That is the order we were given. That is the sensible, ascending order, each step making the next one possible, and it has the great virtue of feeling obvious, of feeling like the only way things could have gone. And Göbekli Tepe takes that order, that whole confident ladder, and quietly turns it upside down. Because here, on this hill, is the temple. Here is the great sacred architecture, the monumental building for whatever gods or ancestors or powers those stone beings represent, and it was raised by people who had not yet taken the first step of the ladder at all. No farm, no village, no stored surplus, no settled wealth, no leisured, organised, hierarchical society of the kind the old story said you needed first. Hunter-gatherers built this. Wanderers, foragers, the very people the old story placed at the bottom of the ladder, the people who were supposed to be incapable of it, they raised the oldest temple on earth, and they did it before the farm, before the village, before the loaf of bread. The temple came first, and that single fact, that inversion, is one of the most quietly revolutionary things that any spade has turned up in the whole history of our looking into the past, and if it makes your mind feel wide and strange in the dark, then it is doing exactly what it should. Now, out of that inversion, Klaus Schmidt, the man who gave the last 20 years of his life to this hill, drew a thought so bold and so beautiful that scholars are arguing over it still, and I want to offer it to you not as settled truth but as a wondering, a possibility to hold, one of those restful open questions that are so much more peaceful to lie with than any hard answer. The thought is this: if, to build the temple, you had to gather hundreds of people again and again over the years, and if, to gather them you had to feed them, and if to feed them you were driven to harvest the wild grasses on those hillsides in ever greater quantities, then perhaps, Schmidt suggested, it was the temple that led to the farm, and not the other way round. Perhaps the need to feed the gathered builders, the pressure of all those hungry hands returning season after season to the sacred hill, is part of what pushed these people, slowly, without ever deciding it, toward tending the wild wheat, toward protecting the best stands of it, toward saving and scattering the fattest seeds, toward, in the end, farming, and it is no small thing, and no accident of the storytelling, that this hill sits exactly where it sits. For this corner of the world, these rolling uplands of southeastern Anatolia, is precisely the region where the wild ancestor of our wheat grew thick upon the ground. Wild incorn, one of the very first grains humankind ever tamed, and it is here, in these same hills, on a mountain not far from Tepe, that the geneticists tracing the ancestry of domesticated wheat have found its cradle. The place where the wild grass and the farmed grain are closest kin, the oldest temple and the oldest wheat in the same handful of country. And so the wondering runs, perhaps it was here, around the raising of these stones, in the shadow of these watching beings, that gathering tipped over into growing, that the harvesting of the wild became the sowing of the tame, and farming was born not out of hunger alone, nor out of clever calculation, but out of the sacred, out of the need to feed a gathering, out of worship, out of wonder, out of the sheer human determination to raise something great upon a hill. That perhaps, in the deepest sense, it was not that people first grew their bread and then, comfortable and fed, got round to building their gods a house, but rather that they first built the house of their gods, and in the labour and the gathering of that building learned, almost by accident, to grow the bread. I do not tell you this is proven, and I would be doing you a disservice if I pretended it were. It is debated, genuinely and vigorously, among the people who know this hill best. There are those who think Schmidt reached too far, who point out that we have not yet found the farms he would need, who remind us that a hunter-gatherer people could feast very grandly on wild food alone without ever planting a thing. The picture is not settled, and it may not be settled in our lifetimes, and I find that, I will confess it to you, I find that entirely restful. Because the question is more beautiful than any answer would be, and it costs us nothing to lie here in the dark and hold both possibilities gently in our two hands. The temple that grew the farm and the farm we are still looking for, without needing to close our fingers on either. If you are finding, as I very much hope you are, that there is a particular comfort in these slow ancient mysteries, in lying quietly by the lamp while a question far older than any of us turns over slowly in the mind, asking nothing of you, demanding no verdict, only your gentle attention as it drifts, then do stay with us here. Subscribe, and settle in by the lamp, and let this be a place you return to, because there is a new one of these waiting for you every week, another old hill or old wonder or old kindly puzzle to lie down beside and let carry you off. And now, having said that softly, let me set it aside and come back to the stones, because I have not finished making you feel the size of what these people did, and I want you to carry it with you as you drift. Think once more of the crowd upon the hill. Not a village that happened to build a temple in its spare hours, but the reverse. A temple that summoned a crowd out of the scattered land, that pulled the wandering bands in from wherever they roamed and knit them together. For a season, in one place, around a shared and enormous task. There would have been no such gathering in the ordinary run of their lives. The land could not feed so many all crowded together for long, which is part of why we think they did not live on the hill, but came to it. So the hill itself, the sacred hill, the reason to come, may have been the very thing that made the gathering possible at all, a magnet for a people who otherwise would never have stood shoulder to shoulder in such numbers. And in that gathering, over the generations, all the seeds of what we call civilization were quietly present, before the word would have meant anything to anyone, the coordination of many hands toward one design, the sharing and dividing of a great labour, the feeding of a multitude, the passing down of a craft and a purpose from the old builders to the young, the sense of a people bound together not by blood alone or by the hunt alone, but by a shared devotion to something raised in stone. All of it here, on a barren hilltop, 11,500 years ago, among people who had no farms, no villages, no pottery to cook in, no writing to record it, no metal to cut it, and no wheel to ease a single one of those 20-ton stones an inch up the slope. It rearranges you, does it not, to sit with that? It gently lifts the beginning of everything we are and sets it down in a different and much stranger place than the one we were shown. We are used to thinking that first we became comfortable, and then we became grand, that the sacred and the beautiful and the monumental are luxuries, things a people earns once its belly is full and its roof is sound. And this hill whispers back to us, across all those thousands of years, that it may have been the other way, that the reaching up came first, before the settling down, that the hunger to gather and to wonder and to build something greater than ourselves is not a late flower of comfort, but one of the deepest and oldest roots of the whole human thing. Older than the field, older than the village, older than the loaf of bread. And if that is so, and here is the image I want to give you to hold as you drift towards sleep tonight, then those hundreds of people hauling on the ropes, singing whatever they sang, feeding one another from the wild harvest, standing the great faceless beings upright one after another in their rings, were not merely building a temple. They were, without knowing it, without any word for it, beginning us. Beginning the whole long story of gathered, building, wandering humankind, of which you and I, lying here in the quiet, are the distant and unlikely inheritors. And the stones stood, and the animals kept their silent watch upon them, and the people came and went and came again, season upon season, generation upon generation, up the hill and down, until, but that is the strangest turn of all, and we are not quite ready for it yet. For having raised this impossible thing, having gathered and fed and laboured and coordinated across all those years to build the oldest temple on earth, these same people would, in time, do something to it that is harder to understand than any weight of stone. They would bury it. But let that wait a moment. Let the builders rest at the top of their hill for now, hands raw from the rope, the last great pillar newly standing in the evening light, before we ask what they did next, and why. And so we come to the strangest thing of all, the part of the story that I have saved for last, because it is the part I turn over most often in my own mind, on nights like this one, when the house is quiet and the lamp is low and there is nothing left to do but wonder. Because after everything, after the quarrying and the hauling and the raising, after the years and the generations of labour that it must have taken to set those great stone beings in their rings, and to carve the foxes and the boars and the snakes gliding along their flanks, after all of that, the people who made Göbekli Tepe did something that no one had ever expected, and that no one has ever fully explained. They buried it. Not the way a thing is buried by time, slowly by the drift of dust and the falling of leaves and the patient forgetting of the world, the way most ancient places disappear a grain at a time until a hill grows over them and no one remembers they were ever there. No, they buried it themselves. On purpose. With their own hands. Over generations, the people who came to this hill carried in rubble and broken stone and earth, and the bones of the animals they had feasted on, basketful by basketful, and they packed it in around the pillars and over the benches and up the sides of the enclosures until the great rings of standing beings were swallowed, until the carved arms and the folded hands and the watching animals were covered over and lost from sight, until the temple that they had spent so much of themselves to raise was gone beneath a mound of their own making. And then, in time, they raised new enclosures higher up or beside, and in the fullness of years they buried those too. I want you to sit with that for a moment, in the dark, before I say anything more about it, because it is a thing that deserves to be sat with. Imagine building the greatest thing your people have ever built. Imagine that it is the wonder of your world, the place your bands gather from across the hills to see, the ring of stone giants with their hands laid over their bellies, keeping their long, silent watch. And then imagine deciding, deliberately, patiently, over the span of lifetimes, to fill it in, to lay it down, to put it, quite literally, to sleep. I find that almost unbearably moving, if I am honest with you, and I do not fully know why. Perhaps it is that we so rarely bury the things we love while they are still whole, and here is the gentle irony, the thing that turns the sadness soft again. It is precisely because they buried it that we have it at all. The rubble and the earth they packed in around those pillars cradled them, held them upright, kept the rain and the frost and the falling ages from wearing the carvings down to nothing. The vulture is still spreading its wings on the stone, the fox is still leaping along the flank of the pillar, the hands are still folded over the belt of fox pelts, 11,500 years on, because the people who made them tucked them in beneath the hill and let them rest. The burial that reads at first like an abandonment turns out to be the reason the message survived to reach us. They laid it down to sleep, and in sleeping it was saved. Now why would they do such a thing? And here I must be honest with you the way I have tried to be honest all through this long night, which is to say that I do not know, and no one knows, and the not knowing is a large and quiet room that we can walk about in together for a while without any hurry to leave it. But there are some gentle possibilities, and I would like to lay them out for you, not as answers to be chosen between, not as a question with a right box to tick, but as soft shapes to rest among, the way you might lie in a field at evening and pick out shapes in the clouds, without needing any of them to be the true and final shape. Here is the first. Perhaps each enclosure had a life of its own, the way a person has a life, and when its time was done it was retired, and laid to rest, and honoured in the laying. Perhaps the ring of stone beings was not a building at all. In the way we think of buildings, something meant to stand for as long as it can be made to stand, but rather something closer to a living thing with its own span, born when the pillars were raised, alive through the years of gathering and feasting and carving, and then, when whatever needed to be done in it had been done, closed, sealed, put gently underground with all the honour of a burial, so that a new one might be raised in its turn. There is a great tenderness in that idea, I think. That the burial was not a forgetting but a farewell, that they covered the stone beings over the way you might draw a blanket up over someone who has earned their rest. Here is the second. Perhaps the burial was itself the point, the rite, the whole purpose toward which the years of building had always been climbing. We tend to think of a temple as a thing you make in order to use, and the making as merely the getting ready for the using. But what if, for these people, the great work was the offering, and the filling in was the final and most sacred act of the offering, the giving back? What if to raise something so vast and so beautiful, and then to return it to the earth, to hand it down into the ground with feasting and with ceremony, was the most complete thing a person could do, a way of giving to whatever they honoured the very best of what their hands could make? We do not know what they believed, we cannot read their minds across 11,000 years of silence, but the shape of the act, the raising and then the deliberate returning, has the shape of a gift given fully, held back for nothing. And here is the third. Perhaps the world was changing under their feet, slowly, the way worlds do, and the burial was a closing of one door as another opened. Perhaps the old beliefs that had raised the pillar beings were softening into new ones, and the people, standing at the hinge of that change, chose to seal the old sanctuary, rather than let it stand empty and go strange. Chose to lay their grandparents' wonder to rest with respect, rather than abandon it to the weather and the wild. Or perhaps it was something we would find almost too simple, some turning of season or fortune or need, some reason that would seem small to us and was mountainous to them, and that has left no trace we can read. And here, if I am honest, is the fourth possibility, the one I keep coming back to, which is that we will simply never know, and that this is all right. That the burial of Göbekli Tepe is one of those questions that is more restful than any answer could be, because an answer would close the room, and the question keeps it open. And there is a great and gentle spaciousness in a question you are allowed to hold without solving. You do not have to solve it tonight. You do not have to solve it ever. The people who buried the hill knew why they did it, and they took the knowing with them into their own long sleep, and left us only the mound and the wondering. And the wondering, I have come to think, is a kind of inheritance too, and not the poorest one. Let that be something to hold as you drift, if you like, not the answer to why they buried it, but the soft, wide, unhurried permission not to need the answer at all. And now let me draw back a little from that single strange act, the burial, and ask the larger and quieter question that has been standing behind this whole night, like one of the tall central pillars standing behind the ring, which is not only why they buried it, but why they built it in the first place. Why any of it? Why a scattered people with no farms and no villages and no writing and no metal and no wheel would pour so much of their brief lives into raising 20-ton beings of stone on a barren hill, and carving them with such care, and gathering to them again and again across the generations. And here too I will not give you one verdict, because there is no one verdict to give, and because the several answers together are gentler than any one of them alone. Perhaps first it was a gathering place, and the gathering was the reason and the reward both. Picture the world as it was for them, a world of small bands moving across the hills after the gazelle and the wild ass, families and handfuls of families who might go a whole season without seeing another face than the ones they woke beside. And then picture a place, one place, high on the land where you could see it from far off, where at certain times the bands came in from every direction, and there were more people in one ring than a child might see in a year of ordinary days, and there was feasting, and the roasting of game, and the telling of the old stories, and the meeting of the ones you would marry, and the news of who had been born and who had died since last the hill drew everyone home. To build such a place, and to keep building it, would be to weave the scattered strands of a whole people into a single cloth, to make of many wandering bands one thing that knew itself as one. And perhaps that knitting together, that yearly return to the great ring where everyone belonged, was itself the deepest reason, worth every ton of stone. Perhaps, second, it was wonder and devotion, the reaching of the human heart toward whatever is larger than itself. The animals carved on those pillars are not the gentle ones, not the tame companions of a settled farming life, for there was no settled farming life yet. They are the dangerous ones, the powerful ones, the fox and the boar with its bared tusks, the coiling snakes, the scorpion, the spider, the vulture with its spread wings, the great horned aurochs. The people who carved them lived inside the living world, not above it, and that world was vast and beautiful and perilous, and it fed them, and it threatened them, and it held their dead. To raise a place where the powers of that world were honoured in stone, where perhaps the honoured dead were remembered, where the wild was gathered into a ring and given a face and a form and folded hands, may have been the oldest kind of worship there is, older than any temple we would recognise, the human need to stand before what is greater than we are, and to make it something we can gather around. And perhaps, third and simplest of all, it was the pure and stubborn human need to make. To leave a mark, to take the softest, most fleeting thing there is, a human life of perhaps 30 summers, and press it into the hardest and most lasting thing there is, stone, and so to say, to whoever might one day come, we were here, we mattered, we made this, and we were not nothing. I do not think we should be too quick to explain that need away, or to hunt behind it for some more practical reason, some calculation of survival, because I am not sure there is one, and I am not sure there needs to be. The need to make something great and lasting seems to sit very near the bottom of us, below farming, below language perhaps, and Göbekli Tepe may be the oldest surviving cry of it, the first time our kind reached for permanence and caught hold of it in stone. And if you are finding, as I hope you are, that there is a quiet comfort in these slow old mysteries, in sitting by the lamp with a hill that has kept its secrets for 11,000 years and letting the wandering carry you gently down towards sleep, then do stay with us, subscribe and settle in here by the lamp, because there will be a new one waiting for you, another quiet corner of the deep past to rest in, every week. And now let me come back to the stone and to you, and to the thing that I think matters most of all in this whole long story, the thing that changes, very softly, how we might see ourselves. Because you and I were taught, most of us, a tidy and reassuring order of things. First, we were told, came the farm. People learned to plant and to reap, and the farm let them settle, and the settling made villages, and the villages grew and grew rich and organised and full, and only then, only after all the ordinary business of survival had been mastered and there was food to spare and time to spare, only then, late in the tale, did people build temples and raise monuments and turn their eyes to the sacred, as a kind of luxury that comfort had earned. First the bread, then the beauty. First the loaf, then the wonder. And Göbekli Tepe, quietly, without raising its voice, turns that whole order over. Because here on this hill is a monument, a sanctuary, one of the most ambitious works of the human hand for thousands of years, in any direction, and it was raised by people who had not yet learned to farm at all, who still lived by the hunt and the gathering of wild seeds before the first field was ever sown. The wonder came first. The gathering, the devotion, the great shared work, the reaching toward the sacred, all of it came before the farm, not after. And some have wondered, and here I tread gently because it is an idea still argued over and not settled, whether it might even have come the other way round from how we were told, whether the need to feed the great crowds who gathered to build and to feast at the hill, in this very region where the wild einkorn wheat grew thick on the slopes and where the earliest tamed wheat has since been traced, might have been one of the pressures that first nudged people toward planting and tending and harvesting, so that the temple did not wait upon the farm, but may have helped to call the farm into being, that perhaps we did not settle down and then, comfortable, invent the sacred. Perhaps we reached for the sacred, and gathered to it, and in the gathering stumbled into the settling. Perhaps the wonder made the bread. I will not tell you that this is certain, because it is not, and the honest scholars go back and forth on it still, and that going back and forth is itself a restful thing to lie beside, a debate with no anger in it, only careful people looking at old stones and wondering aloud. But whether or not the hill helped invent farming, this much it does plainly, and this much is enough. It tells us that the hunger to gather, and to wonder, and to build the sacred is older than the loaf of bread, older than the potter's bowl, older than the written word, older than the wheel. It sits nearer the root of us than any of those. And that, I think, is the humbling and lovely mirror that Göbekli Tepe holds up to us across the deep dark of time. It tells us that the first thing our kind did, when we had gathered enough of us together to do a great thing, was not to make a market or a fortress or a granary, but to make a place of wonder, and to fill it with the faces of the living world, and to lay our hands, in stone, over our own stone bellies, and stand watching. We are the inheritors of those people, not their distant, different cousins, but their children, carrying the very same hunger they carried, the hunger that lies behind every cathedral and every song, and every quiet act of making something more beautiful than it needed to be. When you feel that pull yourself, the pull to build, to gather, to make a mark that will outlast you, you are feeling the same thing that walked those hunter-gatherers up the barren hill with rope and flint 11,500 years ago. It is a very old inheritance, and a very tender one, and you are holding your small piece of it right now, tonight, simply by lying in the dark and letting yourself wonder. So let us gather the threads now, gently, the way you might gather a blanket up around you before you sleep, and lay them each down in turn. We began with a hill, a low, rounded, unremarkable mound of flint chips and thornbush near Anlurfa in the southeast of Anatolia, a hill that a survey team had once glanced at and dismissed, and that lay sleeping under its own weight for another 30 years until Klaus Schmidt walked up it in the summer of 1994 and understood, from the worked flint and the tops of great stones breaking the soil, that here was something older and vaster than anyone had dared to imagine, and gave the rest of his life to the patient uncovering of it. And beneath that hill we found the rings of standing stones, the T-shaped pillars, some as tall as 3 people, weighing as much as loaded trucks, and we came to see that they were not mere posts at all, but beings, faceless and watching, with carved arms running down their sides, and long-fingered hands folded over a belt and a loincloth of fox pelts. A whole silent congregation of stone giants standing in their circles with their hands laid over their bellies. And across their flanks we found the carved menagerie, the fox mid-leap, the boar with its tusks, the gliding snakes, the scorpion, the spider, the crane, the vulture with its wings spread wide, the great world of dangerous wild things gathered onto the stone and kept there, keeping their long silent watch through the ages. And we stood, you and I, before the sheer impossibility of the raising of it, 20 tons of limestone quarried with flint and stood upright and set in rings by human muscle and rope and ramp, with no wheel and no beast of burden, by hundreds of people who had somehow to be gathered and fed on a hill where no farm yet grew. And out of that impossibility came the great reframe, the temple before the town, the wonder before the bread, the possibility that the reaching toward the sacred came first, and may even have helped to call farming and settling and all the rest of it into being. And then, last and strangest, the burial, the deliberate, patient, generations-long laying down of the greatest thing they ever made, the tucking in of the stone beings beneath the earth, which broke our hearts a little, and which also, in the end, is the only reason any of it survived to reach us at all. Those are the threads, and now I will let them go slack, and so may you. Let me leave you, as I always try to, with one plain image to carry down into sleep, nothing to solve in it, nothing to hold too tightly, only something quiet to rest your mind against. Picture it as the light goes long and gold across the hill at the end of a day of work, all those thousands of years ago. The pillars stand finished in their ring, the carving done for now, the great beings looking inward at one another with their folded hands, the fox and the vulture and the coiled snakes catching the last of the low sun on their carved edges, and one of the builders, some man or woman whose name we will never know, and whose face we cannot imagine, tired, dust on their hands. The flint tool set down at last, walks slowly to the tallest of the central stones, and rests a hand against it, flat against the sun-warmed limestone, the way you might rest a hand on the shoulder of someone you love, and stands there for a moment in the gold light, saying nothing, thinking whatever they thought, before turning and walking down the hill toward the fires and the others, and the stone keeps the warmth of the sun a little while after they have gone. And then the light fails, and the hill goes quiet, and the stone beings keep their watch through the dark, as they will keep it through all the darks and dawns to come, through the burying and the long sleep beneath the earth, through the thousands of years of silence, all the way to a summer morning when someone walks up the hill again and understands. That is where I will leave you, on the warmth held a little while in the stone after the hand has lifted away. So let your shoulders come down now, down from around your ears, and let them be heavy. Let your hands unfold. Let the breath go long and slow. Let the questions rest, all of them, the why did they build and the why did they bury, and the was it the temple or the town. Let every one of them lie down in the dark beside you, unanswered and untroubled, and know that you do not have to carry any of them into the morning. There is no test in the morning. There is nothing at all to solve. The hill has waited 11,000 years beneath the earth, and it is waiting still, and it knows, better than anything else in the world, how to wait. Let it wait. And you, rest now. Sleep well. Good night.